It was the summer of 2016 when my cousin Rian and I decided to visit a remote spot in the woods he had discovered on an obscure camping forum. The location promised peace and isolation, a hidden clearing surrounded by dense forest. We packed our bags with essentials and set out at dawn. The hike was grueling, the trail faded in places, and the oppressive silence of the forest seemed to close in around us as we ventured deeper. After 2 hours of trekking, we reached the clearing. It was just as described, flat and secluded, with a narrow creek snaking its way through. We set up our tent by the water's edge, unpacked, and began to settle in. That's when I noticed it, a structure tucked away on the far side of the clearing. Its jagged silhouette stood out against the otherwise pristine scenery. "Is that some kind of shelter?" I asked, pointing it out to Ryan. He squinted before shrugging. "Probably an old hunting shack," he muttered, though he sounded uncertain. The structure was strange, almost otherworldly. Crooked branches formed its frame, while pieces of torn plastic flapped loosely in the faint breeze. There was something inherently unsettling about it, but we brushed it off, chalking it up to a relic left behind by a long-forgotten camper or hunter. As the day went on, my unease grew. The shadows seemed to lengthen around the structure, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. But Ryan's laughter and carefree demeanor helped distract me, and I pushed the strange thoughts aside. By sunset, we had gathered wood for a fire and sat down to enjoy our dinner. The clearing bathed in the warm glow of flames. Just as I began to relax, Ryan stiffened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Faint rustling came from the direction of the structure, followed by a soft clicking sound like stones tapping together. We shone our flashlight toward it, but the beam revealed nothing, just the stillness of the forest. Uneasy but unwilling to admit it, we pretended everything was fine and crawled into our tent as night fell. I woke abruptly to the sound of footsteps crunching through dry leaves just outside the tent. My chest tightened as I strained to listen, hoping it was just an animal. But these steps weren't random or erratic. They were deliberate, slow, and measured, circling us with purpose. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as fear gripped me. I reached for the flashlight, my hands trembling. As I grabbed it, the sound of the zipper on the tent seemed unnervingly loud in the stillness. I opened the flap just a fraction and aimed the beam outside, illuminating the clearing. My eyes scanned the darkness, my heart pounding against my ribs. The clearing appeared empty, but my instincts told me we weren't alone. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, the beam of light swung toward the strange structure on the far side of the clearing. There, partially obscured behind the tattered plastic, stood a figure. They were tall, motionless, and unnervingly silent. The shadows cloaked their features, making it impossible to discern who or what they were. My stomach churned with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I scrambled back inside, shaking Ryan awake. "There's someone out there," I whispered urgently. He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes, but the moment he saw my expression, he was fully alert. After I described what I'd seen, we decided there was no way we were stepping into the forest at night. Instead, we stoked the fire, piling on more wood until the flames danced high, casting long shadows across the clearing. Every noise, every rustle sent jolts of fear through us. At one point, the faint clicking sound we'd heard earlier returned. It was closer this time, echoing eerily in the night. Yet, no matter how much we searched with the flashlight, we couldn't find the source. The hours dragged on, tension thick in the air. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, we were bleary-eyed and desperate to leave. As we packed our belongings in the pale light of dawn, the unease lingered. The events of the night replayed in my mind. The footsteps, the figure by the lean-to, the clicking sounds. None of it made sense, and the thought of staying any longer was unbearable. We hurriedly stuffed our gear into our backpacks, casting wary glances at the tree line with every movement. The hike back to the trailhead was unnervingly silent. The forest, which had seemed alive with the rustling of leaves and the songs of birds the day before, now felt suffocatingly still. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, watching us leave. Neither of us spoke much, each lost in our thoughts, the weight of the night pressing heavily on our shoulders. About halfway back, Ryan abruptly stopped. "What the hell is that?" he asked, pointing ahead. My eyes followed his finger, and my blood ran cold. Just off the trail, tied to the trunk of a gnarled tree, was a bundle of twigs and plastic. It looked eerily similar to the material from the structure we'd seen the day before. The bundle was crudely bound with fishing line, and at its center hung a small wooden figure, carved in the shape of a person. The carving was rough, almost primitive, but it had hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, dread creeping up my spine. Who had left it there? Was it meant for us to find? The implications were too horrifying to dwell on. Ryan and I exchanged a glance, our fear mirrored in each other's eyes. Without a word, we quickened our pace, practically running the rest of the way back to the car. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something, or someone. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with us that night. But every time I see a bundle of sticks or hear the faint tapping of stones, that same dread washes over me, as if the forest hasn't quite let go of its grip. I lived in a remote village, its borders hemmed in by an ocean of towering pines and thick underbrush. It was the kind of place where the forest whispered your name, daring you to wander deeper into its labyrinthine depths. My best friend Lisa and I, craving an escape from our dull routines, decided to go camping at a site suggested by one of her co-workers. Directions were cryptic, mentioning landmarks instead of proper trails, but armed with confidence and admittedly little else, we hopped into Lisa's beat-up Jeep and set out early Saturday morning. The road to the trailhead was nearly impassable, the dirt track riddled with potholes and swallowed by encroaching vines. When we finally stopped, there was no official marker, just an indistinct gap in the brush where the supposed path began. We shrugged and plunged in, oblivious to how quickly the outside world would fade away. The forest embraced us like an overbearing host, its gnarled arms casting fractured light patterns on the ground. After nearly 2 hours of hiking a barely there trail, we stumbled upon a clearing. It was hauntingly still, the air heavy with unspoken warnings. Towering pines created a dome of shadows, while a narrow, babbling stream wove like a silver thread through the greenery. I spotted what looked like a weathered wooden charm dangling from a nearby branch. Its crude design suggested it was handmade, though its purpose was unclear. We laughed nervously, tossing out theories ranging from local folklore to abandoned art projects. As we set up camp, the eerie silence grew palpable. No birds sang, no rustling leaves disturbed the oppressive quiet. "Is it always this still in the woods?" Lisa asked, her voice thin with unease. "Maybe we scared the wildlife," I replied, though even I wasn't convinced. That night, as we sat by the fire trying to ward off the creeping darkness, Lisa's body stiffened suddenly. She pointed toward the tree line. "There, did you see it?" she whispered. My eyes darted to the spot, but all I saw were dancing shadows. "Probably a deer," I murmured, though my stomach churned. Something about the forest felt wrong. Sleep did not come easily that night. The fire's embers glowed faintly, casting fleeting, feeble light against the encroaching shadows. The silence of the forest wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a presence, pressing down on us with malevolent intent. Somewhere deep in the night, a sharp crack jolted me awake. It wasn't the random snap of a falling branch. It was deliberate, like a footstep. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I strained to hear more. My tent was unnervingly dark, and I debated whether to unzip it or stay hidden inside. Gathering courage, I carefully peeked outside. My heart stopped. Just beyond the dying campfire's glow stood a figure. They were perfectly still, cloaked in shadows, their features obscured by the faint light. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure made no move toward me. They simply watched. After an eternity, the figure stepped back into the void of the trees, swallowed completely by darkness. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. A lone hiker? A trick of the firelight? I debated waking Lisa but decided against it, convincing myself I must have imagined it, but the unease festered, gnawing at me, until morning. When the sun finally broke through the dense canopy, I recounted what I had seen to Lisa. Her face went pale, but she was quick to rationalize it. "Probably a curious camper," she said, though the doubt in her voice betrayed her words. As we packed up to leave, Lisa froze mid-motion, her gaze locked on something beside the extinguished fire. There, neatly stacked in a pile, was firewood we hadn't collected. My mouth went dry. "Did you?" I began, and she shook her head, her fear mirroring my own. The hike back became a frantic race against our rising paranoia. Each crack of a branch or gust of wind felt like something, or someone, closing in. About halfway to the car, we spotted something that made our blood run cold. Freshly carved into a series of trees were crude arrows, each one pointing back to our campsite. They hadn't been there when we first arrived. We reached the car breathless, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. The forest seemed to lean closer, as if reluctant to let us go. As Lisa fumbled with the keys, I glanced back toward the trail. A movement, subtle but unmistakable, flickered in the distance. Someone was there, lurking at the edge of the path. Before I could say anything, we were in the car, speeding away from the suffocating embrace of the woods. Once we were safely home, Lisa and I agreed to report the incident to the local authorities. At first, they dismissed it as a misunderstanding, a lone hiker or perhaps a squatter. But a week later, we were called back for questioning. What they revealed left us reeling. The area where we had camped was part of an ongoing investigation into a missing hiker. His abandoned tent and belongings were found concealed behind a dense thicket, less than 100 yards from where we'd pitched our camp. Even more chilling, the police discovered a series of wooden charms identical to the one we had seen on our first day. They had been hung throughout the forest, leading in a trail that ended near our site. The authorities tried to link the footprints and carvings to the missing hiker, but the evidence didn't match. Whoever had been watching us that night wasn't him. The thought still haunts me. Whoever, or whatever, was in those woods had deliberately drawn us to that secluded spot. The arrows, the firewood, the figure in the shadows, it all pointed to someone with a purpose we couldn't fathom. To this day, I wonder, were we being toyed with? Lured into a trap? All I know is that we barely escaped with our sanity intact. The trail that morning was a picture of tranquility. Dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, a cool breeze rustling the trees, in the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path. It was my third day hiking in the national forest, and while the solitude had been invigorating, I was starting to feel the faint tug of unease. Something about the silence here felt heavier than it should. About an hour into my hike, I saw him. He was sitting on a fallen log just off the trail, as though he'd been waiting for me. His dark jacket and well-worn boots blended with the earthy tones of the forest. But what struck me most was his expression. His face was calm, too calm. It was as if he had no intention of looking friendly, yet he wasn't overtly threatening either. He didn't have a backpack or any visible gear, which was unusual for anyone this deep into the wilderness. "Lost?" he asked before I could even open my mouth. His voice was quiet, yet it carried over the stillness around us. "No, just hiking," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, but my guard up. His presence unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. He tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was a puzzle he was piecing together. "Shortcut," he muttered, raising a hand to gesture at a barely visible side trail branching off the main one. I glanced at it hesitantly. It wasn't marked on my map, but I'd read that locals sometimes knew unofficial routes through the forest. "Where does it lead?" I asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. "Cuts hours off, straight to the northern trailhead," he said. His tone was flat, devoid of any emotion or effort to convince me. Against my better judgment, I thanked him and stepped onto the narrow path. As I walked, I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back. When I finally turned to look over my shoulder, he was still seated, staring after me. The shortcut was unmarked and overgrown, the kind of trail that felt more like a forgotten scar in the landscape than a route people used. As the forest grew denser and the sunlight waned, I began to regret taking his advice. The path quickly became treacherous. Thick roots crisscrossed the ground, and low-hanging branches clawed at my arms and face. The dense canopy above snuffed out much of the light, casting eerie shadows across the trail. My initial unease was now full-blown anxiety. Every step felt like a mistake, every rustle of leaves like a warning. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a small clearing. At its center was evidence of human activity. A fire pit surrounded by discarded items. There was a shredded sleeping bag, a tin cup with rusted edges, and a pair of boots so weathered they were barely holding together. The scene was wrong. The items looked recent. Too recent. The fire pit still held the faint smell of smoke, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had I wandered into someone's camp? As I turned to leave, a sound froze me in my tracks, the deliberate crunch of footsteps behind me. Slowly I turned, my heart pounding. It was him, the man from the log. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face as impassive as it had been earlier. "How?" I stammered, but the question died in my throat. He hadn't followed me, at least not through the trail I'd taken. There was no way he could have reached this spot before me. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there like a statue carved out of the forest itself. His presence was suffocating, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. I took a step back, and then another, my legs trembling. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying my reaction. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I didn't hesitate. I bolted in the opposite direction, ignoring the jagged branches and uneven ground as I fled. Every instinct screamed that I needed to get out of there, and fast. My flight through the forest felt endless. The trees blurred together as I sprinted, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every few steps, I stumbled, but I didn't dare stop. The memory of his presence, a quiet, unrelenting shadow, fueled my fear. Eventually, I burst back onto the main trail, gasping for air. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. I half expected him to emerge from the shadows, but the trail behind me was empty. I forced myself to keep moving, putting as much distance as I could between me and that clearing. When I finally reached my campsite, the sun was beginning to set. I told myself I was safe now, that the encounter was over, but the paranoia lingered. As I unpacked my gear, something caught my eye, a piece of paper tucked into the side pocket of my backpack. My blood ran cold as I unfolded it. It was a map of the forest, crudely drawn but unmistakable. The path marked in red was the same shortcut he had directed me to. At the end of the trail was an X, circled twice. I sat there, staring at the map, my hands trembling. What had I walked into? And more importantly, what had I narrowly escaped? The forest no longer felt like a place of adventure. It was his domain, and I had been nothing more than an unwelcome visitor.